If I think back to the launch of that first book, I still approach my launches very similarly, believe it or not. As the tools have changed and the technology and the platforms have changed, to the general principles that I used, I still use to this day. For instance, for every launch, book or otherwise, I have looked at the landscape and interviewed people. So for the book, for instance, I interviewed, and you can interview people who might seem out of reach. Keeping in mind, I had no platform, no nothing at the time.
I remember.
But I just had to reach out and ask. And if you get somebody on a good day and maybe you take your hat off, put it in your hand and do a little begging. Best writing authors were very forthcoming with their time. So in a number of instances, I was able to interview best writing authors. What I mean by that is real prose masters and prolific nonfiction writers who had very, very high quality output on their writing process. So I did that prior to writing the book. Then, seeing that the end was near, and this was all on a schedule, although I faced a lot of hiccups and a lot of challenges along the way, so it wasn't a straight line. But when I knew that my book was probably going to be delivered, was scheduled to be delivered in, let's just say, 3 months, I started interviewing best-selling authors, which are not always the same as best writing authors. And the questions revolved around their most recent launches, and specifically the vehicles or formats or people who seem to be diminishing in impact and those that seem to be ascending in impact. And those that were ascending in impact, I assumed rightly at the time, and this has been true almost every time, would be uncrowded. So for instance, for the 4-Hour Workweek, it became clear even then that television and radio seemed to be, television seemed to be diminishing in its impact on sales.
Okay.
Nonetheless, the dominant playbook included tons and tons and tons of, say, morning TV. But almost every best-selling author I spoke to said, by and large, not worth the effort. They said, however, there are a few other things that have been impressive and notable. Number one is that certain radio programs, like NPR and so on, move a lot of books. This is, again, 2000, let's just call it 6, prior to the publication in 2007. And then towards the end of 2006, and I actually remember this because we're recording this at the end of December, and I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table after Christmas and sitting down to really put together a plan for the first book. And another pattern that had emerged is people said, I'm not really a tech person, but there are these things called blogs. And for whatever reason, these single author blogs move a lot of books. And not a single person I recall in publishing gave a shit about blogs. So what I decided to do, I also had a very self-imposed and also practically limited budget for the launch. So for me, it was like $5 to 10 grand. I can't remember. I had a huge whiteboard and decided to make my target blogs. And there were many conversations that went into this, but decided to put my effort into blogs. What's the most crowded channel? I'm not asking it just about the formats, but also the means of reaching bloggers. What's going to be most crowded? Blog comments, email. These are the most crowded. So I took my budget and allocated it to in-person travel to events where in the hallways and at after parties and so on, I could have drinks around or with bloggers. And I spent all my time in the lounges, I spent all my time in the waiting areas, and that is where I committed my investment of time and money. Who knows if that was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. Maybe I just got lucky, but it worked incredibly well. And I'll just give one more recommendation. And actually, people can find a talk I gave ages ago at South by Southwest, which was called How to Build Your Network in Record Time, or some clickbaity sounding headline, but it does deliver. It explains a lot of this and also how I use South by Southwest. Similarly for the book, because South by was where the book really broke out.
Yeah.
But there was a bunch leading up to it. So this is going a little long, but it might be helpful for folks. Rule number 1, be nice to everyone. And this isn't some feel-good Snow White, hummingbirds landing on your hands kind of thing. This is the right thing to do, but it's also the most practical thing to do. And I'll give a real example. I went to Blog World Expo or something, and I'm hanging around, didn't go to any sessions in this particular case. A lot of folks had pointed out Robert Scoble as a power broker, hugely influential, which he certainly was, and super sweet guy as well. And at that time, I had no contact with him. Yeah. He was the hottest girl at the prom, right? Everybody wanted to talk to him. I didn't really know how to navigate the event, but I knew there would be people who were familiar with it. So I went to a lounge, and I think it was a Seagate lounge or something like that, way back in the day. And there was a woman checking people in and kind of handling the inbound traffic. And I just struck up a conversation. I was like, I bet you're meeting everybody. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm working on my first book. I'm kind of lost here. And we just talked. Like, all that was true, right? Yeah. And we talked and we talked and we talked. And I was explaining, and I'm here. I laid out my whole plan, right? And I was like, well, really, my best option is to focus on the blogs because the publisher owns a bunch of different territory. This is not their first rodeo, but it's my first rodeo. So this is kind of key. There were a bunch of things that I assumed were off limits for me, right? I don't understand radio. The publisher's going to handle radio. I don't understand television. The publisher or other publicists are going to handle that. So the one area I felt where I could play and potentially leverage things was blogs. So I'm explaining all of this. Well, guess what? That woman who was checking people in turned out to be Robert Scoble's wife. And she was like, oh, you should meet Robert. And then that led to meeting Robert. I'm pretty sure I sent him a galley, and I made it absolutely zero expectations. So first of all, I was like, if it would be of interest, I can send you a galley after I described the book for certain facets of it. And I said, what I can do also, because you're not going to probably have time to read the whole book, I'll just put in a couple of Post-its for like the 4 or 5 pages that I think you'll find most interesting, most tactical. And he's like, great. Sent it off. That turned into a blog post he put up about what I'm reading, something like that. Went nuts. I don't recall the exact timing. That was before or after South by Southwest. And South by Southwest was in March. Talk about sales, right? I pitched myself to Hugh Forrest at the time, who I believe was director of programming just for South by Southwest Interactive, not music, not film. At the time, it was like the redheaded stepchild. Nobody gave a shit about interactive or tech. It was just Nerdville, right? Wow. It was small. That was also the year that Twitter launched publicly at South by. You could see all the tweets in the world on one big screen TV where they were scrolling through in real time. And Hugh, to this day, I feel a debt of gratitude. So part of the reason I come back to South by every year is because I feel like it's just karmically the right thing to do. And Hugh is now running pretty much the whole show, I believe, at this point. But I got a last minute cancellation in like the cafeteria, like the Adobe sponsored cafeteria. Somebody backed out. I took a last minute spot. I gave a presentation on the 4-hour work week. I was able to print up flyers beforehand, which I did very last minute. Ooh, and I am blanking on his name. I feel really badly about this, but it was the developer behind Firefox.
Blake Ross?
Yes. And he had very graciously given me a quote for the 4-hour work week. He read a galley. And I can't remember how that came together. I owe him a debt of gratitude as well. But I printed up flyers with that quote, with a couple of other quotes based on galleys, and encouraged people to attend this cafeteria.
Oh, you put up flyers for the event?
I handed them out. Like, I had people handing them out. I put them up all over Austin, right? Printed them out, I'm sure at Kinko's. And I practiced in my friend's garage because I was crashing on a friend's couch. And I remember practicing in his garage with his chihuahuas. You mentioned chihuahuas. He had 3 chihuahuas. And clearly the chihuahuas did not understand the content of my talk, but I used them as the gauge of whether I was engaging or not. So if they started like wandering around, then I had to change my mode. I had to be more Tony Robbins. And I prepared my ass off for this thing. Like it was my first and last opportunity to nail it. And got up on stage. I had this entire presentation with all the visuals. Of course, what happens? Laptop dies. And so I had to improv and just do voice only, which I think ended up being a very good thing. And made autoresponders available. I gave people, this was key, and this is something you do very well, I gave people real time challenges. I was like, here's something you can try today. You're going to be going to a lot of sessions at South by. You're going to take a lot of notes. Here's what I suggest. Everybody gets busy. Things get lost.
Okay.
Here are a few things you can try today. Here are a few things you can try in the next week related to autoresponders. Send me feedback. Let me know how it went. Go on my blog. Let me know. I will give you also feedback, like constructive advice. And it just went ballistic. It went ballistic. And that set the conditions such that I could execute on other things. But lest people think this was this home run international phenomenon from the get-go, that's not what happened. It did hit the extended bestseller list in its first week. But keep in mind, the publisher only printed 10,000 copies. Nobody expected it to do anything. And with those copies, sold the vast majority of them, but that was not enough to hit the real print bestseller list for advice how to, especially, which was hyper competitive at the time. It hit the extended list. So people in the business knew that it was on the list, but not in the print edition. It took an additional 5 or 6 months, if I'm doing the math correctly, to get to number 1 on the New York Times for the monthly business list. And then it just stayed there for years. But to answer your question, in terms of effort isn't enough. Effort is not enough. You need a means of focusing that effort. So for me, I used this what's uncrowded, what's overvalued, what's undervalued. That's how I found podcasts for the 4-Hour Chef. That's how I found other things for the earlier books. And that's how the 4-Hour Chef sold whatever 100,000 plus copies in its first week, was because I jumped on these new things called podcasts. That is also the impetus behind me then starting my own podcast in 2014. But you're right, I put a lot into it because first and foremost, and now I'm getting on my soapbox again, but I really, 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 really put everything into that book. Like, I did not leave anything behind. I put it all on the playing field. And based on early feedback and based on also the many feedback forms, many questions I had asked, many revisions I had made for years, workshopping it in classes, I knew this stuff worked. I knew it worked. I knew, in other words, right, talking about AppSumo and your metrics, like I knew it converted. I just needed top of the funnel. And that led me to the blog. So
wow,
very similar approach that I would take today with most things.